Hello and welcome to this March 2020 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name is George Miller, and my guest in this edition of the programme is journalist Sonia Shah, an expert on the history and development of pandemics, who's written about the origins of the coronavirus in the March edition of the paper, in an article entitled The Microbes, the Animals and Us. Microbes can become deadly pathogens through human interaction with the natural world. The majority of them, like coronavirus, are zoonotic. They originate in the bodies of animals. That's not, as Sonya writes in her article, the fault of wild animals. Habitat destruction brings us into close contact with animals which can pass on to us unfamiliar microbes, and some of them find us a suitable host. Our globalized economy and consumption patterns then do the rest.
This is basically the bill coming due for our system of sort of mass consumption in a globalized economy where we have to use up a lot of stuff and we have to invade a lot of wildlife habitat and pave it over. And that is what provides opportunities for these microbes to come into our bodies. And then we carry them around and then we introduce them into, really dense urban areas where they can refine their virulence.
When I spoke to Sonia at home in Baltimore, with more and more aspects of normal life shutting down, I began by asking her what her days were currently like.
Well, to be honest, they're not that different. I work at home. I've worked at home for 20 years. Obviously, I'm not going on any reporting trips at the moment, but my son is home now and my husband is home now because they both are in universities and universities are online now. So the end result of it really is that I actually have more company at home.
So what kind of things are people coming to you particularly interested in, because you've got this experience of looking at the history of pandemics and epidemics and trying to put them in some kind of context and think about origins and trajectories?
Yeah, I think there's just such a hunger right now to try to understand where this is coming from and why this is happening, which is something I spent, many years trying to understand myself. But of course, without this looming threat of an actual pandemic unfolding. So yeah, I think there's just been a lot of, I've had a lot of people approaching me trying to get a sense of why is this happening, and what does it mean? And has this happened before? Has anything like this happened before? And could it happen again? So I'm doing a lot of writing and talking to people. I think there's just such a need for a vacuum of information. So there's a lot of education we have to do because people have not been paying much attention to the microbial world or how we're changing it, and this is not a story that's new. It's not like it's suddenly happening out of the blue. Experts have been predicting a pandemic like this for 20 years.
Let me ask you, I know that you came from a medical family. So what was it that drew you to this particular area of journalism? As you say, the microbial world, trying to tell the stories of some of these pathogens.
Well, I think, I started out as a political journalist. That's really what I'm interested in is politics. And the sort of underlying theme that has always interested me the most is just this issue of inequality, the lopsidedness of the world. Some people have health, some people don't, some people have wealth, some people don't, and, within societies, across societies. And that kind of grew out of my personal experience being the daughter of Indian immigrants and kind of going back and forth to India and the U.S. when I was really young. And looking at health and microbes just became a really interesting way to expose our relationships with each other, so it's sort of like a way to look at the politics of how we distribute resources and power and how we interact with each other. Because of course, microbes, that's what they do is they take advantage of those pathways between us that we build.
Do the stories of those microbes becoming pathogens and then perhaps turning into epidemics, do they follow certain patterns when you come to reconstruct their stories, or are they like unhappy families? They've all got their own very particular histories and trajectories.
I think both. So what I tried to do in my last book, Pandemic, was I wanted to understand how a microbe turns into a pandemic-causing pathogen. Because, of course, microbes, we have microbes all around us all the time, and most of them are neutral or even beneficial for us. It's only this certain, a few rogues gallery of microbes that become pathogenic to us, and even fewer that become pandemic-causing pathogens. So I wanted to know, how does a microbe turn into that? What is sort of the backstory? And so I focused on cholera, because cholera is one of the most successful pandemic-causing pathogens. It's caused like 7 pandemics since it first emerged. And what I found in tracking the story of cholera and then relating that to how other pathogens had caused pandemics is that they all kind of follow a certain trajectory. These things are multifactorial. So, it's not just one driver. Almost all of these pathogens start out in the environment in some way, whether it's in the bodies of animals or in the case of cholera. I mean, technically it is in the body of an animal, a planktonic animal called copepods in the water. We don't think of those as animals because they're not, furry and warm-blooded, but they are animals also. And they start in the environment and are harmless usually to us in that, in their natural habitat. But then we kind of disrupt that environment in some way, and we create these pathways for microbes in the environment to adapt to the human body. And often what happens is then they become pathogenic. And then, so that kind of environmental disruption always plays a role in the origins of these pandemic causing pathogens. But it's not just that, but you also then have to have transmission opportunities. So, people have to behave in ways that allow the pathogen to move from one person to the next, because of course, these are little microscopic creatures that have no independent locomotion. We have to carry them to each other. So they have to exploit our social relations in some way. For something like a respiratory pathogen like this new coronavirus, of course, that's pretty easy. Like, that's a really easy way to spread between people. But a lot of pathogens are exploiting other weird, kind of more unusual behaviors that we have, like cholera, which exploited the fact that we did not separate our waste from our water and our food, or Ebola, which exploited the fact that we had these certain kind of funeral rites and we're touching each other and each other's bodily fluids when we're sick. So you need to have all that, and then you also need to have like an amplification opportunity. Almost all of them have that, like some place where there's just a lot of transmission opportunities so that the pathogen can kind of adapt to the human body and often become more virulent or refine its transmissibility. For cholera, of course, that was the newly industrializing cities of, the 19th century, where people were moving out of the countryside and packing into these cities with very little sanitation and very densely populated because, of course, there wasn't any kind of mass transit, so you could sprawl. And we're doing that again with, say, all of our influenza viruses, which are being incubated in factory farms, where we have these places where we have hundreds of thousands of individuals very closely packed together. Viruses can drop into there. They may not be that virulent when they drop, when they are introduced into a factory farm, but once they start transmitting faster and faster and faster, viruses, every time they replicate, they mutate and they change. And so, you have this factory of amplification. And that's happening in urban centers today. That's what happened in, West Africa with the Ebola outbreak in 2014, for example. I think we will see what the amplification opportunities that the novel coronavirus exploited. I mean, it seems clear that, obviously being in, emerging in parts of China where, people are densely packed together, or in certain kinds of trade activities that they're participating in. And then we're seeing here in the U.S., we're having outbreaks in our cities, Seattle, New York City, et cetera.
So you said, Sonia, that experts have been warning of a pandemic like this for a good 20 years now. So, and you also mentioned you were interested in the politics of all this. So what was it that was not happening that should have been happening, in your view, in order to be better prepared for this? Or how highly do you rate our preparedness for this, given those warnings?
I mean, in the end, all of these things that I kind of outlined as the drivers of pandemics, environmental disruption, urbanization, our rapid transit, these are fundamental to the global economy. I mean, that's right. So that's what sort of our whole economic system is based on. Those three things are fundamental to it. So, I don't know that the politics was ever there for anyone to say, look, we are ratcheting up the risk of these pathogens emerging and causing pandemics by doing our business this way. I mean, we also were doing that with climate change. And it's the same thing. I mean, this is basically the bill coming due for our system of sort of mass consumption in a globalized economy where we have to use up a lot of stuff and we have to invade a lot of wildlife habitat and pave it over. And that is what provides opportunities for these microbes to come into our bodies. And then we carry them around and then we introduce them into, really dense urban areas where they can refine their virulence. But all of that is just so fundamental to the way our economy runs that I don't think that politics were ever there to kind of tamp that down. Not to say that there were little things we did and that we could continue to do, at least here in the U.S. The U.S. government was funding for about 10 years an effort for scientists to actually actively surveil microbes that might be turning into human pathogens. Because we don't know, which microbe is going to do that, but we do know how it happens. So emerging infectious disease experts actually had created disease hotspots, places where microbes were most likely to turn into human pathogens. These are places where there's a lot of sort of ad hoc development, ad hoc urban areas and slums, lots of invasion of wildlife habitat, a lot of flight connections, all of those things. They put all that together and you can see, well, these are the places where it's most likely to happen. Of course, China's part of that. India's part of that. The industrial, the developed parts of the United States are part of that. And in those places, we can actively look for microbes that might be changing. And then you can stamp them out before they start to spread, before they cause an epidemic. And that was work that went on for about 10 years, funded by the U.S. government and others. Those scientists discovered something like 900 microbes that were changing in those ways. So, this is a kind of work that goes on behind the scenes. When it's successful, nothing happens. So it's hardly even a story. It doesn't make a ripple in our public consciousness. I mean, that's the whole sort of paradox of public health is when it works, nothing happens. So it doesn't lend itself to the optics of like a big political win. So it's just something we have to kind of pay for and let continue to occur in the background. It's why we, have sanitation systems. It's why we clean our water. All of that grew out of epidemics of the past that we then responded to. It's basically invisible, in sort of the national debate. We don't even talk about it.
Yeah, so when it works, no one pays very much attention and doesn't realize, and people don't realize the benefit of it. It's only when something goes so spectacularly badly, as they are now, that we sit up and take notice of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So microbes all the time are sort of, and you mentioned 900, potential pathogens. Microbes are all the time sort of trying to get on this process of becoming pathogens and finding their way into human hosts. So if somebody, as some sections of the press have been writing, suggest, oh, the problem is Chinese wet markets, then they're grievously missing a point.
Absolutely. It's unfortunate that wet markets is where we saw SARS came out, in 2002. But even then, if you look back even 20 years, we've had plenty of pathogens that have come out of Europe and the United States. I mean, we had MRSA that emerged here in the United States, or exploded here in the United States. We have new kinds of tick-borne illnesses. We have highly antibiotic-resistant bacterial pathogens. We're incubating all of that in the United States, and Europe similarly has incubated its own pathogens too. We don't think of them as these sort of invasive germs from somewhere else in these exotic, foreign practices that are encroaching upon us, because these are our germs, right? So they're just, problems that we deal with at home, and we'll come up with a drug or a vaccine. And so the whole narrative about our homegrown pathogens is just totally different than the ones that emerge from some other place.
you've talked about this sort of encroachment, this human encroachment on the natural world, and it can take the form of deforestation and suburbanization and intensive farming, and also you mentioned the impact of climate change on pathogens. I noticed from reading some of your writing in preparation for this, Sonia, you often use the word squelch. You use the word you talk about squelching the emergence of these pathogens. So I wondered, arrayed against all these things that humans are doing to the natural world, where can we look for the ability to squelch? How can and because you've talked about it, the whole way of life of the planet is kind of geared in a certain way. There are certain economic drivers. So where can that squelch impetus come from?
I'm hopeful that at least some sector of the generations that are being traumatized by this pandemic will understand that it's our sort of outsized appetites for natural resources and our endless expansion into wildlife habitat and destruction of wildlife habitat is really what's putting us at risk, not just of pandemics, but also of climate disasters. I mean, these are kind of the bills coming due. And I think, we understood this with, say, environmental impacts a long time ago, right? Like if you wanted to build a mine, once we realized those things are very environmentally disruptive and it's bad for the water and there's all these problems. And so let's think about that before we actually say, yes, go ahead and develop that mine. So we do these environmental impact analyses, that's regulated by the government. And we think about that. So we could extend that model. What if we thought about that for what is the climate risk? What is the pandemic risk, the contagion risk? All of that is embedded in development. There's models of how we could, if we wanted to, if we had the political will to actually incorporate thinking about these other broader risks to our societies and our ways of life from our development models, we could incorporate it. There's many ways.
But from your study of previous pandemics, do you see that humanity has a very strong impulse to revert to business as usual and life as before following these crises? Or do you sometimes see that positives have resulted in terms of human actions and behavior and practices?
I mean, we always change. So definitely lots of changes happen because pathogens are hugely influential in shaping how we live our lives. But do we change in ways that help prevent them from plaguing us? Not necessarily, not in any direct way. I mean, for example, cholera in New York City, they had epidemics of cholera for 80 years. Finally, when they decided to clean up the water, one of the prime drivers was not public health, not the fact that, they knew the water tasted bad and nobody liked it, and they actually knew it was making them sick. None of that was the issue. It was because brewers thought that they were losing money because other people's beer tasted better. So they wanted to clean up the water supply so that they could sell more beer. And that was a really influential driver in New York City cleaning up its water supply. And then, of course, magically, cholera disappeared too.
We're talking in the third week of March, and more societies are closing more and more things down, and normal life is grinding to a halt. Do you see how this goes from here, from your knowledge and from all your reading and studying and talking to experts? Can you see, what people refer to sometimes as the exit strategy? Can you see the way in which things develop from here, which puts the best outcomes for humanity on it?
Well, this will collapse eventually, right? So we're not going to be in epidemic mode all the time because, of course, these pathogens are only able to affect this huge toll at the beginning when we have no immunity. I mean, our immune systems are really powerful and hugely, just so sophisticated and so diverse. It's one of the most diverse parts of our, genomes is our immune genes. So we've been doing this a long time. The problem is getting to that point of immunity is costly. So there's going to be a big sacrifice. And the way we're doing it now is we're kind of doing a trade-off sacrifice of, not so many lives all at once, but we'll sacrifice some of our economy instead and kind of try to even it out, so it's not just a lot of deaths all at once, but we kind of, scale that out and hope that maybe a vaccine will come on board eventually, so that we don't have to pay the full price in blood. But, it is costly to get to that point. I mean, you see that in societies that have endemic pathogens, like malaria, for example. Malaria is hugely costly to societies that have it, and it decreases their economic growth year after year after year. And it's perfectly preventable, perfectly curable, and yet we still have hundreds of thousands of people who die of malaria every year. So just having the tools at hand, having the knowledge at hand is only part of the solution, But the way they cope with it, the way malaria societies cope with it, is that they get through this major hurdle of childhood. A typical kid in a place where there's a lot of malaria might have 12 episodes of malaria before they're 2 years old. And that kills a lot of babies. But if they make it past 2 years old, then they've acquired the immunity and they're not going to die of malaria. They're still going to get it, but it's going to be sort of the kind of illness that you and I might have in temperate countries, like, having a cold. So, and that's really costly, but that's sort of what it looks like in the absence of using our tools to prevent or to treat an epidemic disease, an infectious disease. So, for us in, modern societies today, industrial societies today, where we are going to use tools, we're kind of going through that process of like the very deadly process of we're going to have to expose ourselves to this thing eventually. We're going to, try to withstand it and try to kind of slow it down so that, the cost is going to be kind of scaled out over time. But yeah, in 2 years from now, like this is going to be either a seasonal issue that comes and goes like H1N1 is now. H1N1 was a pandemic a few years ago, and now it's just one of our flu viruses that we get every year, or every other year, whenever it comes out. So I suspect this one will be like that too.
And if a vaccine is 12 to 18 months out, will the development of that help us to cope with any future coronavirus, or is each one unique? I'm interested to know, to what extent we're gaining knowledge from this virus that might help us deal with future ones, or to what extent they all have such a unique signature that that every time there would be a 12 to 18 month time period in which we're trying to sort of catch up with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think it would depend on what the vaccine is itself. If it's sort of, we haven't been able to do that with influenza, for example. That's a big sort of holy grail, is to have a universal flu vaccine. So we don't have to develop a whole new flu shot every year. But we do that. It's not hugely effective. I think this year's flu shot is like 40% effective, but that's enough to keep deaths in the range that our healthcare systems and our societies can absorb them. So, it could be something like that.
Just before we started talking this morning, I was looking at the front page of the New York Times, and they're reporting that China says there have been no new cases, locally acquired cases of the coronavirus in China in the past day. So how optimistic should that news make us feel? I know that many of us are in countries where we're still at a very different stage of its evolution, but how optimistic should that news make us?
Well, I guess for me, I feel very trepidatious about the Chinese example because it came at such a huge cost. They were welding doors locked, infected people, they were welding them into their own homes. So the kind of heavy-handed tactics that they used inflicted untold trauma. We don't know what the cost of that is. We won't know for months or years until it's, until this all the stories trickle out of how many people died, and because of the containment efforts, not because of coronavirus, but because of the containment efforts, and how many young people were traumatized, and just we don't know the full cost of those measures yet. I can just kind of imagine it, although we know there was like massive human rights violations and transgressions. That's my question. I'm still unclear on, yes, okay, no new cases. That's definitely good. But does that benefit outweigh the cost? I don't know. I don't think I couldn't answer that question yet.
Yeah. And what about a recrudescence in China as they begin to ease restrictions? Is a recrudescence a very real possibility?
Absolutely. And because this is a wave that's going across the whole globe. So, so China doesn't have new cases right now, but to maintain that, they're going to have to keep their borders sealed at some huge level. They can't have any more introductions, and every introduction they have to isolate and make sure they find and have this really heavy surveillance and restrictions on who can enter. So that too is going to cost a lot, and I mean, we're a species that likes to move, and our economies, our cultures, our societies function because we move around between each other's communities. And cutting all of that off, I mean, we can see the cost in terms of trade and commodities and all of that, but there's also just a huge social cost as well.
Sonia, maybe I can ask you in conclusion, is there a myth that you see circulating that you really feel ought to be scotched, or some kind of appreciation or some kind of optic that you think is not being perceived, that you think it's quite important that people should perhaps use in order to sort of get their heads around what is a very sort of dangerous and scary situation for all of us?
I mean, George, there are so many. I don't think I could pick one. But one thing that I am struck by is that, and this is what was interesting to me about writing about emerging diseases, is that for most of our health issues, we rely on biomedicine. We immediately think, okay, here's a health issue. What drug can we throw at it? What vaccine? What surgery? What medical intervention? We don't think about prevention. We don't think about how can we change the way we live so we don't have these problems. It's more lucrative to sell ibuprofen and aspirin as opposed to solving why people might get headaches in the first place.
Yeah.
And one thing that's interesting about emerging diseases is that you can't do that because they come up too fast. They emerge too quickly. And by the time you get the new drug or the new vaccine, that first epidemic wave has already crashed. So the only thing that works is collective action. We have to change our behaviors. We have to be innovative and resourceful in understanding what those behaviors are. And then we have to agree amongst ourselves that, okay, we're going to stop doing that. So to me, that's very hopeful. I think that strengthens us as a peoples, that it shows the importance of solidarity and collective action and working together and not relying on, a commodity, a corporate product, which would be, a drug or a vaccine.
I was talking to Sonia Shah about her article in the March 2020 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique, entitled The Microbes, the Animals and Us. Sonia is also the author of Pandemic, Tracking Contagions from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond, published in 2016, and The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move, which will be published by Bloomsbury in June. Sonia's article for us is also available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.